the Boeing company, with more than $80 billion in revenue per year, has hired a team of well-connected lobbyists to try to get out from under the cleanup obligations, which would save them a fair amount of money. You've heard how a company, euphemistically calling itself Renewable Resources Group, for which the principal and general counsel is Charlie Stringer, who also happens to be the chair of the water board that enforces Boeing's permit, and a colleague of Charlie Stringer's, Tom Eisenhower, are alleged to have admitted that they work for Boeing. The concern is that they've been doing that to try to create an AstroTurf group to try to push for no cleanup. And so a number of myths about the cleanup have been spread by Boeing and its surrogates. And you may have heard a few of them. And so my presentation is to try to deal factually with those claims. And so we'll go through a few of them. The first has to do with trucks and soil volumes. Boeing and its surrogates have been trying to scare people about trucks, claiming unbelievable numbers of trucks for immense periods of time in order to do the cleanup. The reality, however, is quite different. NASA estimates that the soil cleanup of its portion of Santa Susana would entail about 3 to 4 truck shipments per hour during work hours and work days for a period of a little less than 2 years. If they can do on-site treatment of some of the waste, it would be 3 shipments an hour. If they can't, it would be 4 shipments an hour. Because there are several routes that those trucks can be put onto, that would mean about 1 truck per hour per route. NASA estimates that this would result in an increase of a few tenths of 1% in the traffic on those main routes. And that's taking into account a correction factor for a truck being more of a problem than regular cars, so they count a truck as multiple cars. So a few tenths of 1% increase in traffic. The cleanup of the Department of Energy area should be roughly comparable to that of the NASA area. It's long been estimated that the DOE and NASA cleanup volumes should be about the same. But recently, the people hired by Boeing to help them try to get out of the cleanup agreement have pushed wildly inflated estimates of the cleanup of chemicals at the DOE part of the property, many times higher than those estimates put before. The Southern California Federation of Scientists carefully examined these new estimates and found them to be grossly inflated. The exaggeration basically assumed, and this is quite remarkable, that virtually all of the soil in Area 4, the nuclear area, all of the soil out to where rocks come up above the ground and all the way down to bedrock would have to be excavated and removed, even if there was no evidence of contamination below a few inches or beyond a few spots. So if you read the estimates, they say if you have an area and you've got one measurement that is elevated and the measurements below it are not and the measurements to the side are not, they presumed you'd have to take out the entire huge area. They've essentially exaggerated this to assume you'd take out everything. So in short, the DOE and NASA cleanups under the cleanup agreements, what we call the AOCs, should entail about 1 truck shipment per hour on each of the main routes for less than 2 years each, restricted to work days and work hours. And this is really quite small in comparison with all the trucks that have been going in and out of that site for the years of operation. And many of those trucks were vastly more dangerous because highly irradiated nuclear fuel rods And large amounts of plutonium, for example, were trucked into that facility for years. Boeing and its predecessors never complained about trucks when they were bringing in vast amounts of contamination. But when there is now an effort to clean up the mess that they made, they raise the issue of trucks as a red herring. The second myth that you may have heard about is that cleanup will somehow moonscape the property. It will damage endangered species and trees. They claim it will destroy vast amounts of priority natural habitat. The truth is, again, quite different. The contamination is found primarily at the former operational areas, which long ago were disturbed, badly disturbed, all these reactors and rocket test stands, and operated them so sloppily for so many decades. It would be nice if the people who had operated this facility had tried to protect it, but in fact, they were polluting it for decades and only now are somehow claiming they're concerned about the environment. Here's a picture of Area 4. That's where most of the contamination from the nuclear work is found. And as you can see, it's a very disturbed area of buildings and reactors and burn pits and the rest. Beyond that, the cleanup agreements have special provisions to protect endangered species and threatened species. The Fish and Wildlife Service has veto power over any action involving the cleanup. If they deem that there is some potential unacceptable risk to an endangered or threatened species, it will be stopped by them. No action can be taken that the Fish and Wildlife Service says produces an unacceptable effect. There are other provisions in the cleanup agreements to protect habitat, even if there are no threatened or endangered species. For example, there's a special circumstances exception that allows you to not have to clean up a particular place if there's some special reason for doing so. NASA estimates in its environmental impact statement that its cleanup will temporarily disturb about 7 acres of habitat, conservation habitat, designated by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife as high priority. 0.05 acres of southern willow scrub and 7 acres of Venturan coastal sage scrub. That's out of 451 acres of land in the NASA area. Assuming a similar situation for the Department of Energy portion of the property, approximately 0.5%, half of 1% of the 2,850 acres of Santa Susana would be high priority habitat containing 2 scrubs that would be disturbed by the cleanup temporarily. As to the oak trees, first of all, they weren't doing the nuclear and radioactive work in oak trees. But if they have some place where they polluted some oak trees, and there is one particular location where they've done some cleanup, they've taken great care not to disturb the trees. There had been a former incinerator and trash ash pile at Santa Susana that ended up contaminating an area that had some oak trees in it. And in 2010, NASA began to remediate that because it had dioxins, really bad stuff. Some of that cleanup occurred in areas where there were some oak trees. This quote is from Randy Dean, a contractor to NASA. We got at the soil we needed to with very minimal disturbance to the surrounding environment. That was our goal. No oak tree roots were exposed or damaged during the soil removal. You can see how that was done. They did it by hand. They didn't take in big bulldozers. They kept those beyond the drip line of the trees. They only removed a little bit of topsoil that was contaminated and didn't get anywhere near the tree roots. And remember again, by the way, that there is an exception, that if somehow these people did bury contamination in the area of roots of old trees,
and it was a small amount that you didn't feel you absolutely had to get out, there's a special circumstance exception. Up to 5% of the volume of the overall cleanup you can exempt for such reasons. So here's the last myth. I apologize for the cough. And you may have heard some of this as well. Boeing and its surrogates have been arguing to break the cleanup agreements solemnly signed by the state of California and the Federal Department of Energy and NASA, and to, instead of requiring cleanup to background, clean up to what they claim would be a risk-based standard. I've got big news for you. In the last few months, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has determined that the primary radionuclides of concern at Santa Susana from all of those accidents, which are cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium-239, are more dangerous than previously assumed and must be cleaned up to more rigorous standards. Understand, Boeing is trying to use vastly less protective standards at the very moment that EPA has found these materials to be even more dangerous than thought before and requiring more rigorous cleanup. Here are the figures for the suburban residential cleanup scenario. Cesium-137, the EPA cleanup levels are now 30% lower than they were before. For strontium-90, a really bad radionuclide that concentrates in bone, can cause bone cancer and leukemia, 3.5 times lower. And for plutonium-239, they now say it is 70 times more dangerous than thought before, and the suburban residential cleanup goal for EPA is now 70 times more protected, 70 times lower. You can barely see it in this graph, right? Here's a 30% reduction. That's a 3.5-fold reduction. That is what the new standard is for plutonium compared to the old. Boeing and its surrogates have been, however, pushing a claim that they should get rid of the cleanup agreements and replace it with what they are calling a suburban residential cleanup level. But it's actually not the suburban residential cleanup level. When you compare it to EPA's suburban residential cleanup goals that I just showed you, Boeing would leave behind 194 times more cesium, 545 times more strontium, and put your seatbelts on, 916 times more plutonium than EPA's suburban residential. So they call, hey, let's clean up to suburban residential, but it's not. It's hundreds and nearly 1,000 times less protective. Why would you do that? You can save a lot of money if you relax the standards so you don't have to clean up. I can't, on this graph, even really show you how immense the difference is. For cesium, for strontium, and for plutonium, the blue is what Boeing wants to do. And this tiny line down here is what EPA says should be done. A cleanup to background, which is what the cleanup agreements require, is thus essentially equal to a cleanup to EPA's suburban residential cleanup goals, which is why, to simplify the cleanup, the agencies in 2010 agreed to clean up to background. Look at this for a moment. So the blue are EPA's suburban residential cleanup goals. The purple is what the toxics agency says cleanup to background would entail. For cesium and for strontium, cleaning up to the EPA suburban residential goal would actually mean cleaning up more than cleaning up to background. Now, you really never clean up below background, but in any case, this is more relaxed than the suburban residential EPA standard. For plutonium, they're about the same. So the bottom line is that the cleanup to background is essentially cleanup to the EPA suburban residential standard. But Boeing is pushing a standard which is hundreds to thousands to 1,000 times less protective. So, fundamental question, if Boeing got its way and its surrogates got their way, how much cleanup would occur? My students, and some of you heard their presentation in June, went and compared every one of the 500 locations or so where EPA found radioactive contamination at the site, and compared it to what Boeing has been pushing for its cleanup standards. And virtually none of the radioactive contamination EPA found would get cleaned up if Boeing got its way. If the cleanup agreements are carried out, all would get cleaned up. Look at that. 100% would get cleaned up if the agreement is followed. If Boeing's supposed suburban residential standard were followed, 1.9% would get cleaned up. And that's optimistic because they are also insisting on being able to average. So if I've got one spot that is elevated and another spot a half mile away that's not, they want to not clean up the hot spot. So Boeing's proposed cleanup levels compared to the levels in the cleanup agreements are like 48 times higher than background for cesium, and for strontium 480 times higher for the suburban residential standard. You may ask, what about the chemicals?
Go ahead, sweetie.
What's the story about the chemicals? It's the same. Boeing and its allies have been pushing for not having to clean up the site and are claiming to use a suburban residential standard as their alternative. But that standard, again, is hundreds to thousands of times more lax than the suburban residential standards using EPA's default assumptions or those in DTSC's standardized risk methodology. Here are the numbers. If Boeing got its way, the numbers it's pushing would leave 400 times more arsenic in the soil than if you did a true suburban residential cleanup. For methylmercury,
5,800 times more. For hexavalent chromium, that's the material you all remember from Aaron Brockovich, right? Chrome 6. That would be 658 times higher if Boeing gets its way. Dioxins, 641, and PCBs, really noxious stuff too, 477 times higher levels.
There's no level on that.
Amazing if they can pull it off. So, what's the conclusion? Parties that are responsible for the contamination, like Boeing, but also the agencies that they have so much control over, like DOE and NASA, could save a lot of money if they and their surrogates can scare people into opposing the cleanup that is the only thing that can protect you from their contamination.
I can't keep up.
But their claims are false. The so-called suburban residential standard is hundreds to thousands of times more lax than EPA's suburban residential goals. Boeing and the government contaminated the site. They must meet their obligations to clean up the toxic mess that they made. Thank you.